Okay, in the next 3 videos of this series, we're going to talk about exposure. Now, exposure is a key value, basically getting the correct light in your image. Now, there's 3 really important settings that go into exposure. First is the ISO, or the sensitivity of your sensor, and we're going to introduce that in this particular video. And in the next 2 videos, we're going to talk about the other 2 really key features, which are aperture and shutter speed. So now, if we go back to our photo triangle, we've covered the lens choices and composition, which deal with framing your image. And now we're going to the next point of the triangle, which is the light. And in this first section, we're dealing with exposure, which is one of the components of the light in your image. And the other is color, which we'll deal with more in the white balance videos. So now, the first setting that goes into that E, the exposure of your image, is the ISO, and that's the sensitivity of your sensor. Now, some people like to think of it as a triangle with the ISO sensitivity setting, the shutter speed, and the aperture as like a 3-way triangle, but I like to deal with sensitivity setting ISO separately because I prefer to see it as the gain, setting the gain of your image. So if you're in a scene that's where the light's too dark and you're not getting the correct shutter speed or the aperture you desire, then you can shift that ISO setting, which is effectively setting the gains. You can push that up so you have a more sensitive sensor, and that way it creates a brighter image and you're able to use the shutter speed or the aperture that you desire. These DSLRs actually have a built-in light meter, so when you're looking through the lens, you'll see that there's a scale at the bottom, and if it's in the center position, that's correctly exposed according to your particular exposure metering mode. And if the arrow goes below the center line, which is to the left, then that'll be an underexposed image, and over to the right of the center line will be an overexposed image. Now, that scale is kind of a simplification because it's a little trickier than that, because that just gives you the overall values. Just a quick side point, with these cameras, DSLR cameras, they have different ways of measuring that light value or metering modes, and the more technical way, or the more complicated way, which most people leave it on, is where it takes into account like a grid across your image. And what that does is, if any particular points are in focus, it takes that into account and basically tries to calculate the best lighting situation based on the values across this grid. Now, the other modes, and these are named different things depending on your particular model camera. The other will be center weighted, where the camera selects a section in the center of your view, and that central spot sort of varies in size depending on your manufacturer as well. And what it does is it takes that region and tries to give the correct value for that region, the correct light value for that region. And then finally you have a spot metering mode. Now, that's just a smaller ring centered on your view. So that's handy if you just want to point at some particular spot in your scene and get the correct value for that. It's a more accurate way of just getting a point reading in your scene. So actually that spot metering way is really quite handy if you know that there's a certain thing in your scene that should be kind of around the middle exposure level. In other words, not too bright, not too dark, but it's kind of like that centrally exposed thing. Like, let's say it's a medium grey wall or something in your scene. You can actually point your camera using the spot metering, and 2 ways of doing it. You can either lock your exposure. A lot of cameras have this exposure lock button, so you can actually point at that object or wall or whatever it is and lock the exposure, and then reframe your scene and then take the photograph, and then you'll know that the photograph is going to be exposed how you want. And the other way is to use spot metering to aim at a particular section of your image with the spot metering, and make a note of what the camera recommends in one of your modes, like what the shutter speed and the aperture is, and use that to set it in manual mode on your camera. You actually set those readings, and then you'll know that that'll be exactly how it's exposed. But we'll go a little bit more into that when we start dealing with shutter speed and aperture. But just to know that there are different modes of measuring light that your DSLR camera uses. A really important thing to understand about these DSLR sensors is how exactly they take the photo, because that'll actually show you where our settings come into play. And also to understand that the sensor does not always capture the full range of light that we're seeing. So a good example here, like right now, I've got the camera exposed to my skin tones, more or less, but the background is fairly blown out. And that means the particular chip that I'm using to capture the scene is handling this light in the foreground, but doesn't have enough range to capture that sunlit buildings in the background. So what's happened is that goes beyond the sensor range, and then it's just treated as white. Just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just going to show you quickly the scene without me in it, but what I'm doing is I'm just going to adjust the exposure. So this is exposed correctly for me. And now you notice if I start cutting down the light, reducing the light values, eventually it gets to a point where we can actually see the buildings and the sky clearly in the background. But the foregrounds, we've totally lost detail, we've totally lost shadow detail. So that gives you a good indication that there's going to be scenes where the sensors just cannot capture that full range. When you take a photograph, in certain circumstances, especially when there's like a really bright light source like the sun, you'll notice that you'll be in the situation where you're not always able to capture the light, the full brights to the full darks, because the dynamic range of your sensor cannot cover that full range. And so it becomes an artistic choice, which part of the range you're interested in. I mean, I could say it's compromise, but I don't really like thinking of it as a compromise, because really it's more artistic. For example, a silhouette. A silhouette, it's an artistic choice to have the background exposed with the correct color in the background, but your foreground subject's totally black. In other words, you've lost all that shadow detail in the foreground. So in that case, it's certainly not a compromise. It's actually a conscious decision to portray the picture in that way. So it's an artistic choice. So now I'd just like to introduce another concept which is really key to understanding exposure, and that's the histogram. Let me just show you where you find this histogram on the camera. And it's when you display your images on your camera, you'll notice there's an information button, and in the info button, depending on the model of camera, it may be in a different position, but they pretty much all have this histogram view visible, where you can, when you turn that on, you can scroll through your different images and it shows you a graphical display of the light and dark pixels in your image. So let me just show you on the board exactly what that's showing you. So what it is this is your histogram display, and on this end we have dark pixels. So these are the points on your image that are dark, and all points from the points at this point is the darkest pixel possible. So that's a pure black pixel. And on this end we have the lightest pixel possible. So on your sensor, on your actual photograph, that'll come out as pure white pixel. Now, this range from the darkest pixel to the lightest pixel is the dynamic range of your camera. And so that's what it's able to capture. Now, if you take a photograph of, let's say, a grey object, and you just take a photo close-up, so all you've got is the grey light, you'll end up with a bunch of pixels straight down the middle here. So that'll indicate that you've just got grey pixels. And then if you have some shadow detail on that, then the shadow detail will stretch down to here. And then if you actually photograph that on a black background, then you'll have the black background pixels visible here. And then likewise, if you have a light object in your scene, the light object will be here, and a pure white object will show pixel values here. So what you end up is with this curve, and this curve showing you what value pixels you have in your image. Now, some cameras will actually split that into the different colors, RGB, so you can have a separate curve for each color. But the basic histogram is showing you dark to light levels, and regardless of the actual color of those pixels. This is really useful because as I mentioned earlier, there's in your camera viewfinder you have that little display which shows you correct exposure, and then if for some reason you're underexposed, the little marker moves down to the left to underexposed, and then you also may overexpose your image, and that little marker will show you by moving to the right that your image is overexposed. And each point there is a stop, what's called one stop. So that'll be one stop overexposed, two stops overexposed, and likewise underexposed if you head that way. But this marker shows you that when it's centered, it shows you that your image is correctly exposed according to what the camera calculates. But what it doesn't show you is the actual distribution of that light, and that's the point of the histogram. So you can actually have an image that has a bunch of pixels down here, and then not much in the middle, and then a bunch up here, and it'll show as perfectly exposed, but you may have lost detail here because some of this is underexposed, but that's not going to show you. What it's showing you is that it balances out the lights and the darks. But when you look at the histogram, you start seeing a better picture of what's going on. And what it is if you have a peak right here, and then you have information, so your curve's kind of running like that, then you have a good chance you've cut off information here, and you've actually what they call crushed the blacks. You've actually, all that detail that was in the dark area there, you've pushed it all just to one single black value. And likewise, if you have an image on your histogram like that, and that's your curve like that, there's a good chance you've chopped off highlight detail. So there's a bunch of information variation of light there that you've overexposed the image, and all that detail is lost, and it's just showing as a white area on your camera. So that's why those histograms are useful. So there's in some of the newer cameras actually you can have a live view. I'll actually swap to one of those cameras to show you. Here we have a Canon 60D, one of the newer DSLRs, and this actually has live view where you can take a photograph and rather than looking through the viewfinder, you can just see the image on the LCD display. So that way it allows you to bring up that histogram in the info button and effectively have a live update of what's happening on that histogram. So you can see if I aim it down, I'm aiming it down to the sofa, you can see that the histogram is indicating a total underexposure there because that graph, all the information is shifted over to the left and it's been clipped off. Whereas if I increase or slow down the shutter speed here to increase the exposure, you can see I can center that histogram, so now that'll be correctly exposed. And likewise, if I point it out the window, that's like totally overexposing now, so if I change that and center that histogram, in fact it's still chopping a little bit of information off there. So I can, there we go, so now in that position there, I've exposed, and you've got shadow detail all the way up there and not much clipping, so it's showing you all the detail out there correctly. Of course it's totally out of focus here, so just got manual focus. So there we go, that's our scene outside the window. So that's very handy though. It's worth just getting your camera and turning on live view and turning on that histogram and just pointing at different objects and different scenes and just see what histogram it shows you. And it starts giving you an idea that this is showing you dark areas, this is showing you light areas. And if you point at something kind of fairly grey, it's going to be centered around the middle. So it starts giving you an idea of how an image is composed of different light and dark areas, and how sometimes it's going to be an artistic choice on where you exactly put that curve, because sometimes that curve's not going to fit on the camera exactly. Like for instance, this will be like if I have my whiteboard silhouetted against the sky, and I've chosen to just expose for the sky. I've exposed for the blue sky in the background, but I've chopped off detail here, so the whiteboard, edge of the whiteboard is totally black, but the sky's exposed correctly. So that's a choice where I've chosen to throw away that information for the sake of a silhouette and retain the background colouring. So worth experimenting, just putting on that live view mode, putting on histogram display through your information, and then just really just pointing your camera around and spend 10 minutes pointing at different areas and different light, and then you can just start getting an idea of what that histogram means and how much more information it gives you than just your little exposure scale that's normally visible in the camera. Okay, so where does ISO fit into it? Well, like I was saying, if you have an image and you've tried to expose correctly, but you're not quite getting the settings you want, like let's say it's kind of up there, it's a little bit overexposed, you can shift the ISO to a lower value and that will shift it down. Now, what I recommend with ISO, I've done a bunch of tests, and it's better to use the lowest ISO setting. So most of these DSLR cameras have a setting from like say 100 being your lowest setting, and all the way up to like 6400, and some of them may even go all the way up to 256K on the extended ISO mode. Now, what I found is 100 to say 800, you're going to get reasonable images, but beyond 800, you're really going to start noticing grain in your image. The way I like to think of ISO is it's like turning up the gain. So if you imagine if you tuned into a radio station and the signal was pretty poor, and the analogy is you're in a situation where the light's not enough, it's low light. So the signal's poor, similar to having low light. So you tune into that radio station, then you turn up the volume, which is like turning up the gain so that you can hear what's going on the station. And what that'll do is you'll notice you'll get quite a static, hissy, kind of noisy channel, even though you can make it louder, and you can make it loud enough to hear, but there's a lot of noise associated with that. And that's the same with these cameras. When you're in a darker light situation and you're not being able to use the other settings that you want, you can turn up the sensitivity of the sensor. So you're turning up the gain of the sensor. But the compromise there is you're going to introduce more noise. So you're basically having less light coming in, so you don't have a very strong signal coming into the sensor, and then you're turning up the gain on that information, and that's going to expose more noise. So very high settings like 6400. If you zoom into the image and look at it on the computer at full magnification, you're going to notice this speckled noise. And I actually did a test chart with a scene where I actually took the same scene with different ISO settings, all the way from 100 all the way to 6400, and the results are quite clear that the noise increases as you go higher, and it's fairly linear with photographs. That's a little different when you're taking video, and I'll go into that in the video section. And so that chart, you can actually have a look at that JPEG. Down underneath this video, I'll have an option where you can actually click on the image and see the full-size version of that, and you'll be able to scroll across the image and actually see that change of noise from the low ISO to the high ISO. So the best way to use ISO is just use as much as you need to. Use the lowest value possible. If you're in a situation where you really want to get a scene where the light's getting a little low and you have to use a higher ISO, if possible, rather reach for a tripod and take a longer exposure. In the shutter speed section, I'll go a lot more into that. But try keep your ISOs in the 100 to 800 range mostly, and that will create less noise. So that pretty much concludes this video. So exposure, once again, as an introduction, is the tonal or the light levels of your image, and it's a real art getting that correct and choosing what's pleasing in the range that your sensor can handle. And the key settings for that are the sensitivity of the sensor or the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. So in the next video we'll go into aperture, and that's a real key value for exposure and has some really interesting effects on your images that are not just related to light levels. So I hope you enjoy that video, and thank you.